Good afternoon. Welcome to the 8th RISIS Policymakers Session, Evaluation Studies Potential of the SIPA Database. RISIS project aims to build a research infrastructure for science and innovation policy study, gives access to 14 datasets and to register for firms, organization, research organization. Today, for the newcomers, I would like to say that the project organized every trimester the policy meeting. That are events with the aim to focus on the main outputs and results of the RISIS project, in particular linked to the policy implication. Coming back to the topic of the today's events, I would like to introduce you Fraunhofer team, Susanne Bührer and Ralf Lindner, head of the Competence Center Policy and Society, and thanks them to the valuable study on a SIPA database that is one of the main resources of this project, is the Science and Innovation Policy Evaluation Repository. Susanne and Ralf will illustrate the study, particularly the result of this study from Fraunhofer. And as well, I want to welcome, I'm very honored to welcome also Michael Keenan, OECD, Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So, I would give the floor, if you agree, to Ralf Lindner for a brief introduction to the topic. And I wish to enjoy the conference. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much, Alessia, and good afternoon and a warm welcome from my side as well. Great to see many colleagues I know, and I hope also to get to know those I only know by name in the meantime. As you might have noticed, Jakob Edler, the head of our institute, is not with us today, and we have to excuse him. He's very sorry that he cannot attend this meeting. But he sends his best regards, and I was asked to fill in for him. Of course, there's no way that I can replace him, that's for sure, not least due to the fact that so far I haven't been part of the RISIS project, unfortunately, actually, but I have always been and still are very interested in the RISIS work, particularly because I'm very convinced this project is highly relevant for our whole community. And also for the neighboring policymakers in our SDI policy field. So I really I'm happy to be part of this session here. We at Fraunhofer ISI, and in particularly our department, Policy and Society, we are quite proud actually to be part of RISIS, and also very happy to be in charge of the CYPER database. And before I hand over to Susanne to give the presentation that she and her team prepared, just a few general words on the CYPER database and what we are doing here at this point. We have more than 1,300 evaluations included in the database, which refers to about 960 policy measures, and out of these, about 800 have been coded so far. We think the CYPER database plays a kind of a special role within the RISIS context, because it doesn't have a primary quantitative, but mainly a qualitative approach or focus on the data that is being collected. So I guess next to the EFIL database, which is organized by Emanuela, which I say hi to you, by the way. The cyber database is one of the few qualitative elements in the project, but nonetheless, we are convinced that such a qualitative perspective is an important component for the research and innovation infrastructures, particularly because we do observe a growing need for evaluations reaching beyond the usual attempt of providing legitimacy and accountability to research and innovation funding, but also particularly in view of all these highly complex and challenging systems transformations and mission orientations we have now in our field. The need for learning and formative approaches is extremely high, and so I think the cyber approach might be a valuable contribution to this overall picture. And this is what we want to show in the contribution to the session by showing whether new forms of impact are emerging over time and by what their investigation can be characterized. The importance of evaluation is also, I think, very much supported by the OECD's SDIP Compass, which also asks about the existence of evaluations. And so this is why we are also very glad to have Michael with us, and looking forward to his intervention after Susanne's presentation. So I guess I'll just hand over to Susanne.
Okay. Thank you so much, Ralph and Alessia, for that kind introduction. I'm really happy to welcome to all of you. I'm really happy, and it's a pleasure to present and later on discuss some selected results from the cyber database. I'm as well very glad that Michael Keenan from the OECD will be our discussant today, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing his reflections about the cyber potentials. Finally, I would like to mention that my colleagues Sarah Seuss and Elisa Walbey, who did and do a great job to bring the cyber database forward, are here at this session again. So presumably, if I can't answer a question, I hope that Sarah or Elisa can answer that. So overall, the main aim of the following presentation is to show the potential, but maybe also some limits of the cyber database. We have chosen the topic of impacts to present the cyber database, because this is, as you all know, rather high at the policy agenda. So my presentation is structured as follows. First of all, I will shortly summarize our research questions. Then I will shortly describe the main characteristics of the cyber database. And then the third block will be the most important one, I guess. Here I will present the results of our analysis. And I will here show differences, but also commonalities between the studies that cover different types of impacts. For example, in terms of the timing of the evaluation, their design, the topics covered, etc. Finally, I'll give a summary and outlook, and will then very much looking forward to hearing Michael's input. Just before I start with the first content-related slide, I would suggest that if you have any direct question as regards, I don't know, the figure, the numbers, what else, please post the question immediately. Otherwise, Alessia and her team will collect the questions in the chat, and we will then postpone them to the overall discussion after the two presentations. Okay, let me start with the research questions that we had at the beginning. So first of all, which developments can be identified in the era of impact measurement? In particular, do social and environmental impact topics gain in importance over the time? Second question is the measurement of social and environmental impacts linked to specific methodological approaches and evaluation dimensions? Third, which policy instruments are most frequently evaluated according to social and economic impacts, and what are their characteristics? And finally, in my view, one of the most interesting questions, what is the perceived quality of the different type of impact studies? So, but before we try to answer these 4 research questions, I would briefly say again something about the cyber database. So the cyber database collects and presents evaluation studies across the world with a clear focus on European countries. Our working steps to stick the database together, to fill it in, is first of all, we are searching for and collecting evaluation reports. We use as sources websites of ministry, governmental bodies, research funders, but also national and supranational organizations. Then we start a coding process based on a report template. That step is still largely done manually. So that means that our colleagues at ISI and before at the Manchester University take every single report and fill in a questionnaire, this reporting template, to characterize the evaluation itself according to criteria like timing, topics covered, data collection and analysis methods, but also the corresponding policy measure, for example, in terms of the target groups of the policy instrument, the objectives, etc. So we will later show. We also made some tests meanwhile in trying to automatize this process, but yes, as I said, the main bulk of the work is still done manually. So when we have the evaluation reports coded, and then we do upload them in the publicly available cyber database, where you can use different kinds of search functions. So this is our website. Here you find the repository with the PDF documents for each coded report. You can search all the reports that you are interested in via a search mask, and we are currently developing a free text search function for all the PDFs, which will be implemented by the end of November this year. You can also, if you have a more deeper academic interest, approach the RISIS core facility, and after registration, you can formulate your research question and can then gain access to data that are not published on the website because they are a bit more complex, but you can, of course, have access then afterwards. So, as Ralf already mentioned, overall we have roughly 1,300 evaluation reports collected, and the majority of them are also already coded. You see here the time span. So we started in 2000 with the first evaluation reports, and the peak can be found in the years between 2010 and 2017. Whereas, as I mentioned, because the manual coding is a bit challenging, in that particular year, not yet all reports are already coded, but we are still working on that. The next slide here shows the distribution according to the countries. Here you observe a certain bias. You see that most of the evaluation reports that we have collected in the cyber database are stemming from Austria, supranational bodies, that means the EU and the UK, but also from Germany and Canada. So if you have a look on these country acronyms, you see that most evaluation reports refer to the EU member states, but we also have, thanks to Adriana Bin from Brazil, several Latin American studies there. So because she supported the work for CYPER in collecting and coding evaluation reports from a couple of Latin American countries like Brazil, Argentina, Chile, etc. So let me now come to the findings of our analysis. So this, the first picture here, which I will show you later in detail, shows the following. The analysis of impacts generally has increased significantly since 2008. Scientific, economic, and knowledge-related impacts are considered most frequently. The analysis of social impacts is in line with general development of impact studies and has taken an upward trend since especially 2012. And the same holds true for environmental impact analysis, but this type of impact studies is generally less often mentioned within the CIPER database. So our interpretation for that overall picture is that policymakers have increasingly to legitimize the measures that they have taken to demonstrate the impact of their measure. So here is the figure. The red line at the bottom shows the environmental impact studies. You see overall has the lowest share, but is increasing in the general line. On the top of this figure, you find these economic studies that cover economic impacts, but also scientific and technological impacts. I think most of you are very familiar with the overall development of the evaluation history in Europe and in the single member states. And most of the studies at the beginning, also referring to the framework programs, concentrated on economic and scientific impacts. And this is a bit reflected here in our database. So if we now look for these different types of impacts, we find that approximately 3/4 of the evaluation studies in each impact area are interim. Interim evaluations are performed less often in case of environmental impact studies, while summative final reports are somewhat more frequent in this impact area. Accompanying evaluations, but especially ex-ante studies, are less well represented in our existing data set. Generally, almost all reports have both summative and formative elements, with the former applying to almost all studies. The next figure at the next slide, but also the following figures will show the following what regards the data collection methods. So first of all, database analysis, surveys, and interviews with program participants are by far the most commonly used data collection methods. So the very conventional set of empirical research methods. The use of existing databases is particularly common for social and environmental impact studies. And furthermore, stakeholders directly linked with the program, in particular the research funders, for example, are mainly included in studies on social and environmental impacts. And these two types of impact studies for the social and environmental impacts also involve other parties and other stakeholders beside the program funders and beneficiaries. So our interpretation for that result is that environmental impact studies often have a more complex design than studies of scientific and economic impacts. And what we also can conclude is that that is what you see here, that more sophisticated and more innovative methods are really seldom used. For example, if you look here, this figure 5 summarizes that what I have mentioned before. You more or less have a core group of 3 different kinds of methods. This is databases, surveys, and interviews with different kind of beneficiaries or stakeholders. Then also partly focused groups, but on the bottom you find alt metrics, CV data, and tracking data. All of them are non-reactive and would have the potential to counterbalance the subjective perceptions of beneficiaries, for example, but this is really seldom used in a typical evaluation and impact studies. If it's used, for example, longitudinal tracking data, this is most common again in these environmental impact studies. So if we come to the data analysis methods, here we see that overall, again, the less sophisticated approaches, namely descriptive analysis, is most common and dominant in all types of impact analysis. At position 2, we can find a case study analysis or case studies, which is most frequently used, again, in environmental and social impact studies. Then text analysis, either quantitative or qualitative, is rather common as well there, and can primarily be found in studies on environmental, educational, and social impacts. And partly expectedly, we find econometrics as a data analysis method most frequently in evaluation studies that investigate economic impacts. Again, the less frequent data analysis methods like the network analysis, IP data analysis, and metrics can primarily be found in environmental impact studies. So this is the figure that supports the bullet points that I mentioned. As you see here at the bottom, the descriptive analysis, more or less all studies cover these kind of analysis. Also, case study analysis and text analysis. Input-output analysis is very frequent or comparatively frequent in environmental studies, but also in the economic impact studies, whereas publication data analysis is most frequent for education skills and capacity impacts, and of course the scientific impacts. So when it comes to the design of the evaluation, we find the following results. Overall, the clear majority of the evaluations that we analyzed have a non-experimental design. You see there at the top of this figure that experimental approaches are really very, very seldom. Most frequently, they are mentioned in economic impact study, but we only have 3 reports that really do apply an experimental approach, where we have, for example, more than 80 studies in each impact category. For the non-experimental design, quasi-experimental designs are most frequently found in environmental and social impact studies, comparison with similar measures, again, in environmental impact studies, and the same holds true for the benchmarkings. So what are the topics that are covered in the different types of impact studies? So what I show you here are mainly the differences that occur between these different types of study. So first of all, the different types of additionality, input, output, and behavioral additionality plays a particularly strong role in studies on social or environmental impacts. The uptake of a program, different types of collaborations among different stakeholder groups, but also mobility issues are also primarily topics investigated in environmental and social impact studies. The same holds true, at least for the social impact studies, for gender and minority issues. And finally, environmental impact studies also frequently address coherence, complementarity, goal attainment, and return on investment. Again, we find that the environmental impact studies who have the lowest share overall in our database seem to have the most complex design and approach. So here you find the figure that summarizes the results already mentioned. More or less, I think there are no significant differences in most of these topics that are mentioned in this evaluation database. So as I said, for example, the collaboration partnerships is mainly investigated in these environmental impact studies, but policy strategy development is covered by more or less all impact studies, and the same holds true for this classical question about goal attainment and the appropriateness of the measures. The next slide, here you see that networking, that these minority issues, gender issues, and the scope of mobility occurs rather seldom as an explicit topic addressed in an evaluation studies, and this is very much linked, of course, to the policy objective, to the objectives of the respective policy measures that are evaluated. So accordingly, for example, career effects are primarily investigated in evaluations that cover education skills and capacity impacts. So when we go now a step further and leave the area of the characteristics of the evaluation studies themselves and go to the characteristics of the policy measures, we first investigated what the objectives of funding were. What we found out is that the studies that investigate environmental impacts, they refer to policy measures with the broadest set of objectives. So overall in our reporting template, we differentiated between 15 different types of policy objectives, and the percent of the environmental impact studies refer to 10 different policy objectives, while this applies to only 4% of the economic impact studies, 5% of the scientific impact studies, and 7% of the social impact studies. So that means that evaluation studies where environmental impacts are investigated refer to policy instruments that are much more, or seem to be much more ambitious and more complex than other impact studies. So, and that in our view partly explains why these environmental impact studies are more complex in their design and in their data methods that they used. So among these policy objectives, awareness raising is particularly important for the social and environmental impact studies. So to be correct, awareness raising is an important policy objective, and the topic of education and mobility is most frequent for measures that involve the investigation of educational impacts, and again, participation and advancement of women or minority group in research and innovation is most often among the policy objectives for the social impact studies, followed by studies on educational impacts. So my final slide and following figure refers to the perceived quality of the evaluation studies. So overall, the large majority of evaluations was assessed very positively. So again, this assessment about the quality was done by us, by these individual coders, and we used a scale of 100%. So we could, and as higher the percentage, that means that, for example, the consideration of the context was properly done, then you can distribute a score of 100%, and if the context was not considered at all, that would mean 0%. So what we see in the following figure is that a critical reflection on evaluation design and implementation is most often missing in the evaluation studies, at least according to the coders. On the contrary, the conclusions and recommendations seem to be sufficiently based on the evaluation results. Environmental impact studies are usually assessed more positively. They receive less frequently poor or average compared to other studies. And this is especially true for the coverage of the broader context and the documentation of the information sources. Interestingly, and for us also surprisingly, is that studies on scientific and economic impacts receive comparatively low assessments as regards the coverage of the context, but also the choice and balance of the applied quantitative and qualitative methods. I show here the respective figure. As you see, what is shown here are only the percent of assignments for the sum of poor and average. So as I said before, the large majority of evaluation studies is rated rather positively. And so we decided that we show here only these weaker assessments. And as you see, the most or the weakest block or characteristic is the critical reflection on the evaluation design. So that means the evaluators do not reflect, at least they do not write that in the report, the pros and cons and the limitations of their evaluation approach. And also the coverage of the broader context is not often an integral part of the evaluation studies, but really more or less then focused on issues like goal attainment, appropriateness, effectiveness, etc. So that's for the findings block. I would now like to give a short summary and outlook. So the analysis of the cyber database shows, in our view, that a new type of impact analysis is emerging with a focus on social and, in particular, environmental impact studies or environmental impacts. These studies differ in several respects from evaluations in the field of scientific, technological, and economic impacts that have a much longer history, of course. For example, qualitative approaches are much more common in the still emerging impact fields on social and environmental impacts. These two types of studies often address a much broader set of topics than other impact studies do. And what we also found is that in environmental impact studies are most frequent in countries with a sophisticated evaluation culture, like the EU, Norway, the United States, the United Kingdom, and Australia. So as an outlook for research, in our view, further research is needed to answer questions like, why is the qualitative accompanying approach that is recommended by numerous evaluation scholars for transition-oriented measures that might be hidden in these environmental impact studies not sufficiently reflected in the cyber data? So one potential reason might be that many environmental impact studies are conducted at the EU level, where researchers or evaluators have observed an increasing trend towards standardization for many years. I think all of you here among our audience who conduct evaluations for the European Commission know that these are these 5 question block, like coherence, effectiveness, efficiency, etc. And these kind of evaluations do not leave much room for more formative approaches where learning is in the center. But we, of course, need further analysis based on an updated version also of the cyber data bank. As shown at the beginning, we really have still to update our database, and especially in terms of the coded reports for the last 3 or 4 years, and we can then investigate whether the tendencies that we observed here continue. An outlook for the practice is we would really like to emphasize again the usefulness of the cyber database for practitioners. So as mentioned at the beginning, the reports can all be easily accessed under the cyber website. They can be searched by predefined criteria, for example, the policy objective, but also the methods that were used or whether they have an experimental design. And also this full text search function will be implemented soon. What we have not yet fully realized is the work on more sophisticated methods to assess the performance of a policy measure based on the evaluation reports. So that's from my side. The moment. Thank you so much for listening. I think I would now stop the screen sharing.
Okay, thank you so much, Susanne. In the meanwhile, I share with you in the chat the link to the policy brief. The study from Fraunhofer. You can go and then download the policy brief. I would ask the floor if there are questions right now concerning the presentation of Susanne. No question for now from the floor, so I would give the floor to Michael Keenan, welcome again, and thank you so much for joining RISIS community. And invite him to share the screen and commenting on this valuable study from Fraunhofer and the implication. Thank you so much. Okay. Okay, I see right now a question, but it's better to collect and at the end open the debate if you agree with me. Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Aikiani. I hope the pronunciation is fine. Okay, so we can go on with the presentation of Mr. Keenan. So the floor is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you to Susanne and colleagues for this invitation for me to comment on this excellent presentation and on this very exciting development. What I want to do today is to in the next 10 minutes or so give some comments and views that I have on the work that's been done, and also on Susanne's analysis on her presentation. I mean, the reason why I've been invited to make this presentation, of course, is because I'm responsible at the OECD for the STIP Compass infrastructure, which has some parallels to the infrastructure that Susanne and her colleagues have been working on in mapping evaluations. So what I will do is I'll put up a couple of slides at the beginning just to tell you a few things about the STIP Compass, so that we're all on the same page. And everybody knows what I'm talking about when I make cross references between CIPER and STIP Compass. But I promise I won't go into too much detail. And then what I want to do then is to really focus more on CIPER. I'll make a few reflections on the initial data analysis that Susanne has presented. I also want to raise a few questions that our policymakers raise with us all of the time, and I want to really put them out there to say, or to ask the question, how could CIPER help answering some of those questions? And then I'll move on to some technical questions and issues that I picked up, and finally I'll make a few suggestions on additional features you might consider adding to the infrastructure that you've built already. So I'll start just with a few words about STIP Compass. I mean, STIP Compass is a big knowledge management infrastructure that the OECD has built with the European Commission. It's hosted here in the OECD, but it's jointly funded by the two organizations. And it tries to map countries' policy ecosystems in science and technology innovation. And we try to map the whole system in terms of the policy measures that are in place. And currently we have around 6,000 policy initiatives coming from more than 50 countries inside the database. And we collect this data from the countries themselves, from the policymakers, and they fill in a survey every 2 years. They can update that information as well on a rolling basis. And then we surface that data in this platform we call STIP Compass, where the user can come in. They can use interactive panels to zoom in and zoom out of the data. We have linked data to this material as well. And there's also various types of open search possibilities as well. On top of that, there's open APIs on the data, so it's completely open. Anyone can link their own knowledge management system to it, or they can download the data to do their own types of analyses. So that's sort of STIP Compass in a nutshell. But I'm just going to put up a few figures here for you as well to see. I don't know whether I can get rid of this thing here. Yeah. Okay. So there's the URL kind of at the top there, but we have more than 1,000 policy officials registered to answer the online survey. So this is really a sharp contrast to CIPER, where you've really got a small team of people who are collecting this information. And of course, that has quality implications. So the data you've got on CIPER, I had a look at it. I mean, it's very high quality data. The data we have, I mean, I don't want to say it's low quality, but it has quality issues, particularly for some of the countries. We have around 6,000 policy initiatives in there, and we collect information on about 50 core questions through this survey. So we really cover the whole system, the whole innovation system. And the current survey, 59 countries participated. That's just finished now, and they've provided data on around 2,000 new policy initiatives and updated information on 3,000 others. And all this data will be published openly on the 22nd of October. I mentioned already we have these interactive dashboards, so we've got more than 700 of these in the portal, and each of these dashboards has at least 6 interactive data panels where you can interact with the data. We have also this linked publications, so we've got around 4,000 Commission, 4,000 OECD, and around 20,000 academic articles linked semantically to all of this policy data. And of course, this hasn't come cheap. Over a 6-year period, we've spent between the Commission and the OECD around 2.7 million euros on this infrastructure. And of course, that also misses the mass of time that the policy officials are spending on providing the data. So that's really just almost a tip of the iceberg, if you like, of the cost of this. And where are we now with regards to page views? We have about 120,000 page views in the last year. So it's going up quite steadily. That's about a 350% increase in page views since we launched the portal in 2018. Why? I mean, why have we built this? What are the main use cases, if you like, for STIP Compass? Well, the users are the policymakers first and foremost, but also the policy shapers, the consultants, the academics, and others who are doing various types of analyses which then inform policy making. Students are using it extensively, academics as well, to publish papers. We use it a lot inside the OECD, and so does the European Commission. So the European Commission use it as part of their European semester process. We use it a lot in our analyses, as well our projects that we carry out in the OECD. And how do we use the data? Well, we often use it first and foremost just to check, to see what's there, what is the country doing, or what policies exist for a particular challenge, or how many countries are using certain types of policy instruments, what do those policy instruments look like, as we go into some detail on the designs of policy instruments as well. So there's a number, that's the sort of first type of use, but you can also do much more sophisticated things with this. As I said, the data is open, you can download the data, and you can start running all sorts of fancy correlations and the like in order to try and see other patterns within the data. So that's all I'll say about STIP Compass by way of beginning. And I just wanted to, as I say, to tell you these things so that you can see some of the parallels that I'm going to draw upon now when I make my comments on CIPA. So first I'll begin with some reflections on your initial data analysis. And I have to say that the first thing that struck me was that I wasn't really surprised by what you found. And I think that's reassuring. These are the patterns you've seen, I think, are things that we would have expected. And that means that I interpret that as meaning that you've done a very good job at coding these evaluations. So that's definitely a big plus. The other thing though is that I mean, there are some differences I think that you've seen between these different types of evaluations. Again, mostly I think things that we'd expect, but also things that require more explanation. So, for example, you raised, you identified the fact that environmental impact studies are more complex, they have more objectives. And then you ask the question in a couple of places. So first, is it just by nature because they have many more objectives, they're more complex? Does it mean that these studies are by nature, are they going to be more complicated to carry out? Is there going to be kind of layering of different methods? Or is it because we're only starting with a lot of these, there's a sort of learning curve, so there's a lot of qualitative methods that are being used, but perhaps in some point in the future, there'll be more sort of standardization in the way that these assessments are made. So I think by looking at your data that you've highlighted these things, I think this raises these interesting questions that then can be used for further investigation. I was also struck by the finding you had at the end on the quality. I don't have that point on here, but around the uses of the more sort of quantitative approaches around economic and scientific impacts. And I was wondering there what possible explanations could be. I mean, I don't know whether you've looked at this, but perhaps these tools are in the hands of people who don't really know how to use them, or perhaps they're being used in a sort of overzealous way as well by those who are very familiar with them and perhaps are overconfident in them as well. So I think this would be an interesting question to look into more detail. You highlighted that, that many of the evaluations, I think you said 3/4 of the evaluations are interim evaluations. And that makes me think, again, an interesting question here will be what impacts these evaluations are actually having on policy. So if they're interim evaluations, we assume that they're being done in order to see whether policies need to be reset, redirected in some way, fine-tuned. And I know that's outside the remit of of the data that you're collecting, but perhaps by bringing together the data on where in the policy cycle these evaluations have been done, the sorts of objectives for the evaluations, the approaches, whether they're summative, informative, perhaps there's some patterns that could be further explored to get more of a handle on what the possible impacts and uses of these evaluations. And a final point on your analysis, I mean, you're focused mostly on evaluation design and the like, but you're also asking questions about policies as well. So by looking at evaluations, there are some sort of proxy things we might be able to say about policies themselves, and I think that's really important. And this data does give us a good opportunity to do that. On the other hand, there are of course quite long lag times here. So the evaluations, most of which you've mapped around 2015 to 2017, I think is your biggest population. These are probably evaluations of policy initiatives that were initiated in 2011, 2012. So we're talking about those policies from almost a decade ago. And if you want to start asking questions, as you raised in one of your final slides, around transformative innovation policy, mission-oriented innovation policy, a lot of those haven't really come on stream until later in the last 5 or 6 years, and so there's a lag there in the evaluations. So we're not able to get a good handle perhaps on some of the policy change that we're seeing through this data alone. Moving on, I just want to raise some of the issues that we get presented with all of the time from our member countries in the OECD. The normative turn in STI policies is real. I wanted to put some data up, but I didn't have time in the end to show you the patterns that we've seen in STIP Compass, showing that there has been this uptick in policies, STI policies addressing societal challenges, which again is not a surprise. We know it. And this raises evaluation challenges, of course, as well. And these are a concern for our member countries, the sorts of questions and challenges that they often discuss when they come here to Paris. And some examples here, they ask us, well, what's the international evidence base on the effectiveness of the policies we're implementing? And we get asked this all of the time with regards to STIP Compass. They often complain, well, you've got all of these policies in there, but you don't say a word about their impacts or their effectiveness. And my standard answer is being, well, our colleagues at CIPER are building a database, and we're going to link to that database when they launch it. So I'm very much looking forward to linking your data, in fact, to STIP Compass. But that's of course not enough. They also have other questions. So they ask, well, how do we implement new generations of policies like mission-oriented innovation policies and transformative innovation policies? And how do we evaluate those new generation of policies, and how do we evaluate the policy mix in its entirety, not just these individual specific policies? And of course, things like missions and transformative are very broad. In any case, they're typically policy mix type of interventions. They're not often single policy instrument interventions. And of course, these are very challenging questions given the range of objectives, the actions and stakeholders that are implied by these sorts of policies, and they call for systemic approaches, not only to evaluation, but of course to policy design as well. So how could a database like CIPER help these countries, our delegates, with these sorts of questions? I think here we need to take a step back and ask, well, what does the CIPER value chain look like? Is it just an intermediate product that provides baseline data on evaluations that then people take away and they do their own analysis? or could it add further layers of intelligence? I mean, it already has the filters and the like, which are really, really very useful. But is there anything else it could do that leverages its data model, exploits linked data possibilities to answer the sorts of policymaker questions that I raised in my previous slide? And if it did try to do that, I mean, what could this look like? I mean, what would these further layers of intelligence look like? Would you be looking for example, to develop sort of guidance for those who want to do evaluations, different types of evaluations, then using the data that's there to illustrate how this has been done by other countries? Would there be? Would you maybe want to build various types of data stories that illustrate various facets of evaluation or types of issues around evaluating particular objectives or types of interventions? And of course, another question here is how could other parts of the RISIS ecosystem be leveraged? I mean, there's a very big infrastructure here. The point was made at the beginning that CIPER and the new to be launched EFIL database, these are a little bit standalone in that they're dealing mostly with qualitative data, the policy data, whereas the other elements of RISIS are mostly dealing with quantitative data. But there is that challenge there of how could those other parts of the RISIS ecosystem be leveraged somehow to provide extra intelligence or insights from this policy data. And I think it's important that these sorts of questions are settled. I mean, they're never settled for once and for all. Of course, this is a continuing conversation. But I think it's a point now that you need to come to some sort of settlement on what it is that you should try to do here, because it's important to set expectations and what CIPER, at least over the next year or two, should try to achieve. And I mean, I've put these questions up, but again, these are questions that we get asked all of the time in STIP Compass. So this is where I borrowed them from. Here, again, going back to this question, like what are the opportunities of linking CIPER data to other data sets? And the chart here on the right shows what we're doing in STIP Compass. So we have this policy data based on this survey that we do with our countries, and we link it to publications, to statistics, and to tweets and RSS feeds, and we do all this semantically. So we don't hardwire anything. Everything is done semantically. But we also have other ambitions. So we want to link to other existing databases like CIPER, for example. But there are others as well out there that the Commission have, for example, that we have also inside the OECD. We'd like to try and link to administrative data, but we barely started thinking about this, and there are many challenges. We're trying to do that. Web scraping is another promising sort of technology, one that our member countries would really like us to exploit because they hate completing the survey, of course. So they would like the OECD and the Commission instead to collect the data from their websites. And another sort of linked data would be if we could, if we take all of this data I've talked about here, if we could run some sort of natural language processing tools on top of this, or other sorts of tools, and then on the basis of that offer various types of knowledge services, which we would then link the policy data to. This again I think is a nice opportunity, but something we're quite far away from really scoping out at the moment. But these, as I say, these are the opportunities we're looking at, and some of the things we've done already, and you may want to, you may want to think about these in CIPER, but I know you're doing that already, and I know you've done some experiments, and I hope, Susanne, that you'll be able to tell us a bit more about some of those experiments that you've done, and share them more widely with the audience here today. So CIPER doesn't aim to cover all evaluations made in the field. You said that at the outset, but what are the costs and the benefits of this scope? I mean, I was struck by the fact that you've got quite a bit of imbalance in the countries that you're covering, for example, and the fact that you're not trying to be comprehensive, but that of course limits then maybe some of the general things you can say about evaluation practices and about policy developments. But I think there are some important benefits as well. I mean, you're able to really develop a high quality database here, where if you try to cover everything with the resources you have, I mean, I think that would certainly compromise the quality that you have at the moment. You could go for a more distributed model, of course. And I think in earlier an earlier phase of CIPA that was experimented with, but there are all sorts of, again, quality issues that creep in when you try to do that. And final point on here is like, I've talked a little bit about mission-oriented innovation policies, transformative innovation policies. And the question here is, well, does the CIPA data model need to be revised in light of the interest in these new generation of policies? And this is a question we ask ourselves in STIP Compass as well, because the way that our data is currently presented, if you come into all the interactive dashboards, it's a rather traditional sort of national systems of innovation view on STI policy. So there's nothing wrong with it, but could it be, do we need to do something more? I mean, we're talking about more directive types of policies. Perhaps the data needs to be organized in a different way. So if we were to do that in STIP Compass, we wouldn't throw away what we have already, but we put another sort of layer, another data model layer on top of what we have already, and we try to map what we have already there semantically, in order to try and bring a different perspective, if you like, to the data. But we haven't tried to do this at all. This is something that we're thinking about at the moment, and I know for sure there are going to be many challenges with trying to do that. But again, I think it's something you might want to think about in the context of the CIPA project as well. And then when I had a look at your database, and one of the first things I was a bit disappointed with was that when I clicked on an evaluation, I was just brought to the PDF of the evaluation. But what I would have liked to have seen was some sort of like fiche that uses your data model that sort of characterizes the evaluation. We've done that in STIP Compass. So of the 6,000 initiatives in there, we have this fiche which you can print off as a PDF, and it looks very nice, and you get this nice summary of the evaluation. And I mean, you have everything already there inside inside the database, and I'd encourage you to give some thought to packaging that up into these little features. And then beyond the current, and I have to say, very useful filters that you have on the database, perhaps you could add a sort of recommendation engine that suggests similar evaluations to look at. So of course, using the filters, I can see that that I can see similar sorts of I can see evaluations that have similarly targeted various objectives or different target groups, or use different sorts of methods. And I think you can build up filters. I didn't try that, but I think you can do that. So you can kind of make your own recommendation engine through filtering. But it would be interesting if the system itself could offer something so that people don't have to necessarily go through those filters. And again, I suppose that then brings us back to, well, who's the audience, which I haven't asked for this. I mean, we assume it's for policymakers, but it's also for analysts. But if it is for policymakers, they may need a bit more help. They may need things like this sort of recommendation engine, so that they get very quickly to access the sort of information that they're looking for. And finally, this also relates to the policymaker use. I think you should give consideration to interactive data stories that highlight interesting patterns in the data, so the sorts of analysis you've done now, but also that links then to individual evaluation reports or to extracts of those reports, or to collections of reports as well, because this will bring the data more alive and make the portal more alive as well. And I think it's a good way of interesting those beyond the analyst community. And there are other things as well. But I mean, just to finish off, I make all of these suggestions and recommendations, but I mean, above all, I think this is a great thing you've built here, and really congratulations to Susanne and Sarah and Elisa and all of those who have been involved in this. It looks really, really useful. We in the Commission and the OECD are very interested in linking CIPA data to STIP Compass. We've talked about it between us internally. We've told our member countries for a while now that this is going to come on stream when they ask us about evaluations, and I will. We have our committee meeting coming up in a few weeks' time, and I will mention that this has now appeared, and I'll provide the URL to our member countries. The final point. I mean, there are of course many development possibilities here, many different directions. you could go in, and you mentioned some of those at the end in your presentation, Susanne, but it would be good to hear a bit more about some of the experiments that you've been doing, which you didn't tell us about today, which you've told me about privately, and also about your thinking on some of these and some of the directions you might go in the future. But I'll stop there and just say again, thank you very much for inviting me to make this intervention. Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much, Mr. Keenan, for your comment, your observation and analysis of the CIPER database and its future challenges. Now I'll give the floor to Susanne to add something about the future challenges of CIPER database related to the observation of Mr. Keenan and the way in which the CIPER database could be useful for the policymaker and in the future.
Yes, thanks so much, Michael, for this summary and for raising up all these very, very important points. I think some of them can be answered now in this session. Some of them need, of course, further reflection. Before I directly go to your questions, I'm not sure. So we got also 2 questions in the chat before Michael's presentation started. I could answer them afterwards or bilaterally, or how shall we proceed? Just not to forget to answer them as well.
No, at the end, because it was interesting to open this debate on the critical aspect also of CIPER database. So you can go on this, and then we can answer the question we see on the chat. Okay. Thank you so much, Susanne.
So first of all, if I may start with your reflections on our presentation. So the first question was the differences in uniformity in the patterns. What we expected? I would say partly. Yes, I think one phenomenon indeed was that as less mature evaluation or impact dimensions are, for example, in this field of social or environmental impacts, as more qualitative approaches are required. So, for example, I think we have a really great set of standardized indicators, criteria, etc., for economic impact and for scientific impacts and the technological impacts. That is investigated since the 70s, so at least the 80s. But for these emerging fields, much more in intelligence and reflection is needed, I guess, to really to find descriptors or indicators to assess the effectiveness, appropriateness, etc., of measures that aim for these kind of impact. And I think this was confirmed in the data set, for example, all these approaches like case studies, etc. Where we were surprised is that innovative approaches and non-reactive approaches occur rather seldom, at least in the set of evaluation studies that we had. So because I think issues like CV data analysis, that is not a new topic. I think it should be reflected in our database as well, but apparently this is not reflected in the data. So this is at least for me surprising. And also these results on the quality assessments, but I would like to be more precise here. So the basic question for that assessment was as followed. It was not whether the quality of the method applied was bad, but whether the quality was appropriate and satisfactory given the purpose of the evaluation. So that means that might be that the evaluators applied extremely sophisticated methods, but maybe these methods did not refer appropriately to the core evaluation question, and that was the background for these a bit poorer quality assessments for the scientific and the economic. So that's for these expectations that we had beforehand and how they fit with this data that we had. The more complex design of the environmental impact studies baked in a learning curve. I think that strongly links to that what I've said before. I think we do not yet have, in many regards, so these more or less standardized set of descriptors, etc. And these indeed requires some sort of learning in doing that kind of impact study. So I wouldn't say it's baked in. It's really a learning curve, I hope, that we observe here. The very important question, what impacts do evaluations have? We can't answer that question with our CYPER data, but the predecessor project in appraisal asked explicitly the policymakers how they assess the evaluations and what happened or what resulted from the program evaluation. And the overall result was that I wouldn't say nothing happened, but radical change was extremely seldom. So I think also in the German case, so if I think we had in the 25 years or 30 years that I have an overview on, I think we had two examples that a program evaluation really led to a stop of a funding measure. So usually you have some incremental adoptions of the instruments, but no radical shifts in the policymaking. This is really a continuous step-by-step learning project. So I would describe it like that. So if maybe anyone from the audience has a different opinion here, but this is what we observed, as said, 10 years ago when we made this analysis of the predecessor project. I don't think that the situation changed a lot during the past 10 years as regards the impact of evaluations, but I'm pretty open to learn more from the audience about that. The last question on these lag times and policy evaluation and emerging policy trends, I think this brings me to a general weakness of the CYPER database, I guess, at least as far as we manage it at the moment. So with this manual coding based on a reporting template, that means that we are to some extent inflexible to quickly implement new and emerging questions. So we have the set of, I don't know, 30 predefined questions, and we tick boxes. We say, okay, put in, yes, they used a survey, yes, they used interviews, etc., etc. But we can't, based on this coding system, not yet answer the question you have raised. But we try to use this more sophisticated method that we really go into these texts and look for exactly these the developments, trends, etc. And we tested it for performance, for statements on the performance of the measures. And that brings me just quickly back to one of the questions in the chat. So whether we investigated the recommendations part of the evaluation studies. No, so far not. We really more or less stopped. We only asked our report template only foresees the question whether the coders see that the recommendations are clearly derived from the empirical data, but we do not yet foresee in these codified system and any more sophisticated analysis methods. But I would like to use the chance to ask Sarah, who started all these more sophisticated methods on how to say, you have the better terms and the correct terms for your innovative methods to make a better use of the CYPER database.
Yes, and I think I can at least respond or comment to one of the question. Would it be possible to use to link the database and use more kind of the text mining approaches or even KA? Currently we at Fraunhofer ISI we have separate project trying to investigate with text learning methods. Firstly, whether we can replace or at least complement the manual coding now by machine learning approaches. And the second question we asked is whether we can also with text mining approaches, whether we could say something about the performance of the actual measures, which is something that for the moment the coding does not look at all on it. Yeah, it's the question on the effectiveness you raised. For the question on can we replace the coding, we have done some step forwards, and we'll slowly come to the end. And I think one of the big conclusion is that it's complicated. And it's complicated because evaluation studies are quite heterogeneous in their nature. They are not only heterogeneous with regard to the content of their interventions, but they have also no common structure of the report. Of course, you have evaluation criteria, and a lot of them are used, but how they're used, if they're used, it's completely up to the evaluator and also the commissioner body. So sometimes it's a mess. The language and the styles are quite differently, and I don't mean one is in English and one is in French, but the way how it's formulated, it's culturally depending. It's often commissioned studies, so you have also a kind of diplomacy in it, and you have a lack of concise formulation. So it's not like in other texts where it's clear in part one, you find the methodological chapter and then you find the recommendation, but you have a lot of repetitions, and recommendation might also be included in other parts. So for the moment, this is something we have to figure out how to go forward it, and it makes it difficult for text mining approaches. One possibility would be to kind of concentrate, for example, only on recommendations chapters or only on the summary, and not look at the whole report, which sometimes it's 200 pages. So yeah, we are looking into it at the moment.
Okay, thank you so much, Sarah, for your contribution. I think right now we can go through the question of the chat. The first was of Arasha Aikani. Have you looked to Susanne from our team? Have you looked at the suggested implications of the evaluation studies? Technically, the conclusion part of the reports. Just curious if there was a current implications communicated in such reports, and to what extent across country, time, topic. So,
yeah,
thank you.
No, indeed, this is something we did not yet look for. So this is not yet covered by these coding system. But as my colleague Sarah said, we are currently testing a bit more sophisticated approaches, and I fully agree that the question raised is absolutely important from an academic, but also from a very practical point of view, to make more use of all these material and texts that we have collected so far. But so far we cannot yet say something on these recommendations.
Okay, thank you. And the other one is from Nicola Dotti. Thanks for the presentation. The database looks really interesting. I'd like to know if you identified some subclusters, for example, reports from some institution receiving higher attention or preferring some methodologies. Thanks again. I surely start using your database. Thank you, Nicola.
Yeah. Thanks for that comment and question. It would be very interesting to investigate these questions. We did not yet do that. We are really mainly focusing in collecting the reports and coding them and publishing them. So the more or less simple line that I presented at the beginning, we did not yet have enough time or capacities to start these exploitation activities, but these are absolutely great questions. So, and we could analyze them by the evaluators, by the countries, and all these kind of things. Thanks a lot for that.
Okay, now Emanuela Reale has a question for the team. Emanuela, please, the floor is yours.
Okay, first of all, let me thank Susanna, Sarah, and Michael for the very, very interesting presentation and comments. Really interesting debate. I have one question to Susanne, a colleague, and Sarah, because I was a bit surprised about the fact that they propose this distinction, this sort of classification between quantitative evaluation and qualitative evaluation that is really poorly understandable, because evaluation generally merge the two approaches, and it's difficult to, I don't understand really how you can qualify one evaluation as quantitative and another as qualitative. For instance, let's say case studies are one key element for evaluation generally. A case study qualitative or quantitative? Case studies is a quite hybrid type of methodology. So that's my interesting, because for instance, your observation that environmental impact is more qualitative than other type of evaluation in other type of instruments. That's quite interesting, because indeed environmental impact, research impact is also analyzed for the item of resilience, and resilience is difficult to be understood using a simply quantitative approach. So it's something that I would like to understand better. What is the base for your distinction? On the other hand, I think Michael suggests very important items also for the RISIS infrastructure, because he was asking about the value chain of CIPR within the overall infrastructure. And indeed, this is an important question, and that's my interest, because RISIS has a lot of exposure with data on the performance level. It's clear. And it's very evident when you look at NOMAC and other visualization tool and other services that you have. But indeed, we have also one kind of set of data sets which are on the policy learning side, which would complement the analysis on the performance side. And cyber is indeed one of these with the other field which will be presented next year on funding, on R&D funding. And these data sets should be completely linked, or to some extent harmonized or matched, or anyway, finding some kind of interaction with the STIP data set. How do you call your platform? Because it's difficult to say that it is a data set as a normal data set. Anyway, for instance, in our case of funding instrument, one matching point could be the STI policy area classification, which is very simple to have and could allow to have some dialogue between the two. And the same can be true for cyber. Of course, my colleagues are more expert than me for understanding how these linkages and matching could be done. But and it's true that both the data sets can be useful for policy mix analysis. Supposing that policy mixes is not only the combination of different instruments, but also the combination of different logics within one single instrument, because we can, and that's what we already see in different both funding instruments and evaluation records. And in this respect, I must say that I'm a bit surprised about your point about the normative turn in STI policies, which is a concern of the different countries, and your emphasis on tools like MOIPs, which is extremely normative, because it's exactly how you have to shape policies. It's not, sorry, it's not a criticism, it's just for a confrontation, scientific confrontation, because it's exactly the way in which you can operationalize the normative tool in policies of different countries. So I think that we, and this is very, I will have to thank again the colleagues from Fraunhofer in charge of the CyPR dataset, because this is indeed the very interesting point we have to develop with RISIS. What is the common features that we can share together in order to improve the capability of our research dataset, because this is one important element, Michael. RISIS is supposed to supply datasets and data for research purposes, but also are very, very interested in supply evidence to policymakers. So how can we interact and match our efforts? Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much. Just briefly on this topic of these qualitative methods, honestly speaking, that was a pretty reduced statement for me. So basically, of course, reality is more complex. But what we observe that the tendency to incorporate also many qualitative approaches in terms of case studies, I think holds true for that kind of studies, which doesn't exclude that also, as we said, environmental impact studies also use numerous other approaches. So maybe it would be better to say that the method mix is much broader for that type of study than for the other ones. But I would really like to give the floor now also back to Michael, but also maybe Ralf would like to add something about on the policy mixes and the challenges, how to evaluate that kind of new instruments.
Yeah, maybe, I don't know, maybe should I just start? Thank you, Susanne, because indeed, Michael also kind of triggered me by basically by all his comments, that's for sure, but by one comment specifically when he was referring to mission-oriented innovation policy, and when he said that the STIP Compass is also kind of thinking about new ways of including these more recent policy developments. And at Fraunhofer ISI we're working quite a lot in the recent years on understanding mission-oriented innovation policies, and also developing a concept to measure impact of mission-oriented innovation policies, and looking at the specific characteristics of missions, that they are cross-cutting, that you have to combine like more or less traditional SDI policy measures with sector specific policies, thus creating a very leading to the fact that the policy mix is so important for these missions to actually succeed and to have impact. This then in turn creates a lot of challenges, I would say, for evaluation, and also covering these things in a database. How far can you actually spread the scope of such a database? Can you look into I don't know, into the mobility sector and try to grasp how innovation policy measures are combined with certain mobility regulations, are combined with investments, because this package is actually what makes the beauty and the potential of missions. And so I guess in general, this is a challenge for the whole innovation policy community. How do we kind of connect and interact with the policy experts from neighboring fields? And more specifically, of course, what does that mean for our databases that are so important for our field, and how do we deal with that? I'm sorry, I have more questions than any meaningful answers, but those are some of the issues we're starting to struggle with more and more.
Okay, thank you so much, Ralf, for your intervention. I would ask to the floor if there are other questions about the SIPA database, possible integration in the future of our resources. No question from the floor. So I think we can go to the conclusion. So I would ask Susanne if you can wrap the conclusion of your work.
Mm-hmm.
Underlining the possible development of the SIPA database in the future month.
Yes, as already mentioned, we are still, but maybe Sarah could add one or two cents. So the internal project runs until beginning of next year. So with these text mining approaches, isn't it? So I always yeah. But really so my conclusion for that session in overall would really be that we should look for a common date for Emanuela's team and Michael's team. So, because I'm afraid, so otherwise, if I do not have a deadline or a concrete appointment date, I yes, really have some difficulties to bring things forward. So, because other deadlines intervene then. So, my first very pragmatic lesson learned for today would really be when this session is closed, we can really look for a common date where we talk in more detail about the potentials to link the databases or to foster the exchange and etc. So furthermore, I think what I will surely do together with the team members is that we should ensure that all these technical issues that have been raised. So I have to admit I'm really lost with the technical debates about linkages of databases. But we have, of course, to ensure that we have people on board. We already have Sarah, but we also have people in the background, in the back office, who deal with all these IT issues. That they could join us in such this discussion round. I think that this is one discussion that we have. What is a further lesson? So thanks for the feedback that we got. That it is really very helpful. That motivates also that we have. So to say that we really have a great yes repository, and we should make much more a treasure or something like that. So and we should really make much more use out of it. So we have these tons of reports and they are there in the repository, but now it's really, I guess, time, despite all data lags that they still might have, but it's really time to start the exploration process. And I would really be happy to do that in a team with other colleagues as well. So that would be my conclusion.
Okay, thank you so much, Susanne. Thank you to Fraunhofer team. I would like to remind you that our next event will be on 3rd of December on ESIT, European Social Database.